Good morning. Today is Rosh Chodesh Adar, the 30th of Shvat, the first of 2 days of Rosh Chodesh Adar. Today is, we have our Levi and our birthday. Today is February 12th, and today we have a number of wonderful reasons to commemorate, to celebrate, and to dedicate our learning. So let's start. First of all, Reb Noach has been on since the beginning, and we're commemorating today the 50th yard side of Reb Noach's grandfather, and surely learning Liloi Nishmasai. It should be a blessing for his neshama and for the family. Second of all, and excitingly, we are honoring and dedicating today's learning for the birthday of our dearest Levi. I hope you can hear us. Our dearest Levi, who just celebrated his birthday yesterday, and we're in Dr. Pasternak's birthday season.
Yes.
Today's learning is dedicated to honor our dear Levi, our dear doctor, on his birthday, and with wishes for a year of mazel and bracha and happiness and naches and everything, gesund, and everything in between.
Amen.
Amen.
Today we will also mention, as we have been mentioning since the beginning of the week, the yard site that just passed of Eliyahu Tzvi, Rabbi Yochanan Halevi. That's our absent Levi's father's yard site. And the month has been dedicated for Chayalea Bas Binyamin Aleha Hashalom. For all those reasons, we dedicate our learning, and of course, for the healing and health and blessing and prosperity for our community, our small Talmud community, and our local Ocean Drive community, and all of Klal Yisrael. And so that is our dedication and our welcomes. Today, we are continuing on the subject that we've been discussing for a few days. Painful, interesting, brings up a lot of questions. It's the subject of a correlation between certain misdeeds, certain averot, and potential punishment or consequences. Much of what we have been reading, studying, is based upon the writings, the words of the Toichecha, of the admonishment that Moshe Rabbeinu administers to the Jewish people in the name of God, that if the Jews mishandle Jewish society in Israel, God forbid, they could find themselves banished from the land. There are other verses as well which point to different kinds of consequences and the like. And that has been the subject of our learning. And I've been emphasizing and re-emphasizing that, of course, the way we should try to view these teachings is also about the beautiful positive and the unnatural blessing that comes from engaging and experiencing Yiddishkeit and following the mitzvot and following the Torah. I want to make one more point. Which is that our sages tell us that sometimes studying the passages of the Toichecha, the admonishment, will be enough to be yotzei all of the tzaros. Right? If you study a subject of Torah, it's as if you've done it. So there are those that say if you study the Toichecha, it's as if you've already experienced and done whatever you need to. And so as we study some painful potential consequences, may Hashem see our studying of Torah as being yotzei for any hardship or difficulty that may be warranted for us or for Klal Yisrael. And that's another way to look at this and remain positive. Again, now that our Dr. Our Levi has joined us, we'll again mention that we continue to honor his father, whose yard site was earlier this week. I'm sorry?
I think we lost Noah.
It's like today we somehow can't have too many people on at one time. There's some kind of, but anyway, so again, Eliyahu Tzvi, Rabbi Yochanan Halevi. And with that introduction, let's share the screen and jump right in. Let's see. Actually, hang on 1 second. Yeah. All righty. So, now we have our Kohen, we have our Leviim. All we need is Noach to come back and we'll be good to go. All righty. So, we started, again, we're continuing to talk about the series of painful potential consequences that are portrayed in the Torah. And so, we're going to continue where we left off yesterday. Actually, this we read yesterday. Just to point out, we'll start over. Just to point out, it's interesting, we talk about, the Torah here is talking about crass talk or vulgarity And it's actually one of those areas of Judaism where there's sometimes it's like tension or confusion about how Judaism views crass or vulgar speech. And of course, on this call we have parents and grandparents and educators, and of course we feel uncomfortable. And I'm gonna correctly for crass and vulgar language, but sometimes there is questioning. Is it really not ideal in Jewish thought? And so, in case you're wondering what Judaism, or the Talmud at least, has to say about crass and vulgar language, let this Talmud be a good source for that. On the flip side, and maybe some of you will agree with me, sometimes you have to pick your battles, and you have to know there's also different cultures which influence. So in certain environments, certain words are considered less crass or more mainstream, for better or for worse. So we're certainly not taking a strong and hard position. But in case you were ever wondering about what the Torah says about nivel peh or nablus peh, this would be your source. I'm going to read this fast. We read it yesterday. For vulgar speech, troubles abound. And the youth of Israel could, God forbid, perish. And you have widows and orphans crying out with no one to answer. And the verse that we're going to quote here is from Isaiah Shenemar, Al Kain, Al Bechurav. Sorry about that. Al Kain. I'm going to do one more change while we're already messing with you. Al Kain al Bechurav leYismach Hashem. Therefore, from the young men, Hashem will not find joy. And there won't be compassion for the widows and the orphans. Kichulo chanef umeira, because they are totally chanef. Here, Rabbi Steindl says ungodly, umeira, and evildoers. Every mouth speaks nivola, translating here as wantonness, but connected to the word nivel peh. Crass or vulgarity, and for all this, his anger is not turned away, his hand is stretched out still. So the verse is being brought to show that there is a correlation between nivel peh, crassness of speech, vulgarity, and some of the troubles enumerated in the verse of in the prophet of Isaiah. The Gemara then asks, what's this last word? V'oid yadai netuya. His hand is still stretched out. What does that mean? Interesting Talmud. Amar Rav Chanan bar Ava. Rav Chanan bar Ava says, Hakol yodim kalal. The Talmud is going to give us a little bit of a definition for crass speech, and it might be different than simply using one of the words, one of the four-letter words or whatever or else it is. The Gemara says, everybody knows what happens after a wedding, or why part of the process of a young couple getting married. But a person that chooses to be crass and spell it out, if you will, even if person has a lot of good things in store, they could be transformed. So I think we also have to point out that we're not talking about denying, but there's a certain crassness at a wedding to make a big announcement, and that wouldn't be part of the refined hopes that the Talmud has for people. Again, I think today's culture may see things differently, but that's not necessarily a good thing. We could say maybe necessarily not entirely a good thing. Anyways, interesting. Take it. You could discuss further. Amar Rabba Bar Shela Rav Chizda, Rabba, son of Shela, quotes Rav Chizda saying, Kol hamenabel es piv, a person that speaks out crassly, vulgarly, ma'mikin al gehenim, his gehenim gets deeper, which I don't suppose is something good. Shenemar shucha amuka pizaris. The verse here in Mishlei, the mouth that speaks perversity is a deep pit. He that is abhorred of the Lord shall fall therein. But the thing the Talmud is focusing on is shucha amuka. We're talking about pizaris, a person that speaks in a foreign, icky way. Then there's a deep pit for them. Rashi, muchenes lepizaris lemisha pivzara. It's prepared for somebody who speaks this way. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar Av Shemeya B'Shoisek. Even a person who is party to such crass and vulgar conversations and doesn't speak out, Shnamar Ze'um Hashem Yipol Sham, Hashem's anger can fall there. And so it's clear from this Talmud that there's a very harsh and strong view on speaking crassly and vulgarly. Interesting. Rav Oishia. Rav Oishia says, Kol hamemarek atzmoi lavera. A person who prepares themselves to sin. Rashi says, Mefana libo lekach. He clears off his desk. He takes care of all other affairs, or removes them from his mind, and he turns towards whatever the sin he hopes to engage in. Chaburois uvtsoim yoitzim by. A person could develop, excuse me, a person could develop wounds, bruises. Shenemar chaburois petza tamruk bira. Sharp wounds for one devoted to evil. And such a person could be caused to suffer hidrokan. The disease of edema, is that how we say it? Hidrokan. We're talking about a bowel malady. Sometimes a person can identify within themselves that they may have committed a sin if they're experiencing certain disease. I guess the Ben Yehuda says, in case you're wondering what kind of sin we're describing here, we're talking about. I'm sorry?
Yeah, we have a different page. We don't have the Gemara.
What do you have?
We have the Rebbe.
The
Rebbe. You're talking about all those bad things, and you're showing a picture of the Rebbe.
That's very interesting. Because what happened here? Let's try this again. That's very interesting. How long did you not have the text?
Right about the time you started talking about the.
All right, let's share it again. I know what happened because I pulled off this page to a separate window, and I guess instead of showing you the window, I showed you anyway, okay. There could be worse things to be staring at. So the Talmud again says the person that prepares themselves for a sin, and the Ben Yehuda says we're talking about znus, immoral behavior. So God forbid they could have skin maladies. The Ben Yehuda seems to say this may be an STD. Again, I'm reading into his words, but he says like this: we're talking about a person that's engaged in immoral, intimate acts with they're not their primary partner, not their spouse. And so then he says, there's some kind of disease that physicians recognize that would occur by people that had many, many, many partners. And we're talking about certain wounds and warts on one's private parts. And so maybe the Talmud here is talking about an STD. Sorry about that if that was, anyways, but that's what the Ben Yehuda says. All right, let's continue. Taner Rabbanan. Shloisha minei hidroikan. There are three kinds of this stomach gastrointestinal malady. Shalavera ava. If a person is experiencing this as a result of punishment for sin, I don't know if we're describing the stomach. It says they're thick. I don't know what we're talking about here. Sharav tafuach. If a person has a gastrointestinal malady as a result of hunger, I guess their bowels are swollen. Vishal chshafim, and a person that's being targeted by witchcraft, then their flesh becomes very thin. So we have thick or coarse skin as a result of this illness. We have bloated and swelling, and then we have thin skin connected to 3 different potential causes for this GI malady, if it's because of sin, hunger, or being targeted by witchcraft. All right, let's continue. Shmuel Hakatan Chashbe. Once upon a time, Shmuel Hakatan, great Shmuel Hakatan. Shmuel the Little was a scholar known for his great humility and concern for others. Again, I'm reading the Sefaria provided short biography. Hence, he was chosen to compose the text of a blessing in the Amidah prayer, calling for the elimination of those endangering the Jewish people. So the prayer of Vilam al-Shinim was composed by Shmuel HaKatan, and here you see he lived literally in the generation that followed the fall of the temple, 80 to 110. He also didn't live a particularly long life, as we can see. According to this, if we're, again, these are approximate, but we're talking about possibly even just, is that 30 years? But yet he's so great, and he actually is the one who composes a whole 19th prayer in Amidah. And he's back to our commentary. So he once fell ill. Maybe in general he was not well. Amar, Ribono Shel Olam, Mi Mephis, Master of the universe, who will draw lots? Rabbi Steinsaltz says, meaning, who will be able to determine that I'm not being punished for sin? Now people are going to think that I transgressed. And not everybody knows that there are different causes for illness. And what's wrong with that? I guess a person doesn't want to have a bad reputation. And maybe particularly if he's the guy who composes the prayer about heretics and people that are causing harm, and then he ends up getting sick, people will say, you see, the guy wasn't so sincere himself. He had his own agendas. So that's just conjecture. But anyways, Itasi. After this prayer, he was healed. So the prayer basically says, Hashem, you're going to cause people to be misled to think I sinned, and he was healed because of that prayer. Abaya Chashpe. Well, you know what? The rabbis have a long history of this hydrokin illness. Abaya also was sick. Amar Rava, his good friend, debate partner, commented to the other rabbis and students, Yodanobe ben Achmeni de Machvin Nafshe. We know that Abaya is not being punished. It's a result of him starving himself. He doesn't care for himself, and that's why he has fallen sick. Well, guess what? Rava Chashbe, Rava also at one other time had this illness. The Gemara says, Rava Huda Amar Nefishi Kitili Kidar Minafche Kafan. Rava, didn't he teach that many people fall ill because of not relieving themselves when they need to, which would indicate that Rava was careful to care for his health, and he didn't deprive himself of food, and he didn't deprive himself of relieving when necessary? So the Gemara answers, and this is a little bit of an interesting segment of the Talmud, Shani Rava. Rava is unique. The Ansile Rabbanon B'idnei Bal Korche. He has a problem. He's a Rebbe. He gives a long sermon, and then when he finishes, he needs to use the facilities, but the students don't let him leave. They hold him captive to continue asking him questions. And so because the poor rabbi isn't afforded the opportunity to use the facilities in a timely fashion, that could have caused him to fall ill with a GI condition. Rashi, Hatalmidim Hakfuyim Lahem, Eis Lefanav, Einstein Oisei Lahashis Nekavav, the students. And by the way, I always feel a little guilty. I mean, I'm a rabbi, but I'm a shul rabbi, so I give classes, but Baruch Hashem, people are pretty kind. I don't find myself being held hostage. But Rabbanim, whose primary task is to give halachic piskei dinim, halachic verdicts, I always feel bad when I interact with different Rabbanim and we have to ask different shilas. And I'm always like, I try to be super aware that, these rabbis are getting calls off the hook And if you're a rabbi who makes yourself available, you very well don't have much of a life and much downtime unless you take your phone off the hook. I mean, I guess I could say the same about my phone sometimes, but so I always feel kind of bad. Like, you never want to, you always want to be extra careful to make sure the rabbi is able to give you the time, because for all you know, the poor guy has to go to the restroom and you're keeping him hostage, or other kinds of such reasons. So we got to be thoughtful about the people that we hold up. You never know why they seem to be in a rush. Anyways, that's the Talmud over here. Taner Rabbanan, Arba Simonim Hein. There are 4 different signs. There are 4 ideas that are presented as signs in this context of punishment. Siman L'Avera, Hidroikan. The correlation, the sign of Avera, and again, I think we're talking about immoral acts, would be Hidroikan, a specific strain of this GI malady. Siman L'Sinas Chinam, a possible symptom of hatred without a warrant, unwarranted hatred, Yerakon, a jaundice of sorts, a miscoloration, greening of one's face. Again, I don't know if in those days
that we have more blue-collar voters in the Republican Party now.
Similar gases haruach, a sign for haughtiness. Anios could be poverty. Similar lashon hara askira, and a symptom, a sign, a consequence of lashon hara, slander, is askira. And Rashi says, it's an illness that begins in the intestines, but ultimately travels upwards towards the throat. Hanikra bun malan. Once again, if you'll indulge me, we will inspect our dear Oitzer Lazi Rashi, the compilation of Rashi's French words. Let's see what Rashi was talking about in his time. So, bear with me just a moment. All right, Rashi's talking about a malady called Bun Milan. I don't know how to pronounce it, but we'll see soon. Bun Milan, Petzach Hamor, a serious wound. So I don't suppose in French that meant a serious wound. It probably was a euphemism for a kind of illness that was known back then, and a serious wound or a serious illness. Bon malant. I don't know Old French or Modern French for that matter.
It's neither.
What does it mean in Modern French? Bon is good.
Malant, I never heard of that word.
Malant might be like either from the shorish of malady, or I don't know. You know what? I'll stick to my expertise. But anyways, it's interesting. So Rashi, in those days, apparently there was a reference to a kind of illness which was very severe, referred to as bumalan, and that was what Askara is in the time of the Talmud. Taner Rabbanan, our sages taught. Actually, hold on one second. Let's just go back to our other. Let's see if anyone else has a comment. All right, let's continue. Taner Rabbanan, our sages taught. Folks, we're turning the page now to 33b. Let me just text Noyach. Let me just make sure that he didn't. Hang on. All right, Taner Rabbanan, our sages taught. Askra bala olam. This illness, bomalan, comes to the world al hamasar, for neglecting to take masar, for neglecting our ladies. Rashi ha'oichel peirosav tevolim, person who consumes the fruits that were not prepared and didn't have the masar deducted. Ubemisa bidei shamayim hizui misasai mida keneged mida. The Bezdin does not enforce matters of tithes, so this would only be minat shamayim. So any kind of illness could potentially be associated with that. That could be Hashem's way of punishing, says Rashi. Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Yossi, Aimer, al lashon hara. Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Yossi says, no, this is the consequence for Lashon Hara. Amar Rava v'Teimer Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Ma'ikra, is there a verse that alludes to this? Hamelach yismach belokim, yishalol kol anishma boy ki yisocher pi doivrei shoker. This is a verse of Tehillim that says, the king shall rejoice in God. Everyone that swears by him shall glory, for the mouth of them that speaks lies shall be stopped. So we have a lot of Tehillim that says the good people that follow Hashem, that are nice to others, they'll be exalted, and those that are bad or speak poorly, etc., will be stopped. That's the literal interpretation. But the rabbis, the Talmud sees this verse and sees the word Yisacher pi doivrei sheker, that there is askara. Yisacher, sachar sounds like askara. And so it sounds like maybe there is a correlation between doivrei shoker, speaking badly about another person, and askara. So I believe that's what Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is saying, that for Lashon Hara, for speaking badly and falsely, that's how you could get, or that could be a verse alluding to a correlation between poor, bad speech and this malady. All right, dear friends, this concludes, at least for the moment, our long section about consequences. We're now going to go to a very, very famous segment in the Talmud. I'm happy that our professor is on the call because he's been so helpful in the past to help us see new value, new light, and new insight in well-known tales. And we're now going to explore another well-known tale of the Talmud. And let's see. I'm sorry, I jumped the gun. There's one more. Okay, I apologize. That introduction is true, but it's going to be a few lines down. I got ahead of myself. There was the following dilemma. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yossi, Alashon Hara Kamar, Oidilma, Af Alashon Hara Nami Kamar. Rabbi Elazar said that Askara is connected to Lashon Hara. Was he saying it only happens for Lashon Hara, or was he saying it could also be for Lashon Hara in addition to other famous aforementioned issues? Tashema, we're going to try to bring proof to understand the view of Rabbi Elazar. What is Askara only triggered by Lashon Hara or other sins as well? Tashema. Now we're going to tell a tale, but not the tale I was referring to. Kishenichnusu Rabbi Seinu lekerem b'Yavna. When our rabbis gathered together in the famous Kerem b'Yavna. What was Kerem b'Yavna? So first of all, you may be familiar with institutions today that are called Kerem b'Yavna or Yavna. And of course, we know famously Judaism was reconstructed from the ground up in Yavna. And that was the first center, the first capital of Jewish life in the process of being reborn and rebirth after the fall of Yerushalayim, the fall of the Second Jewish Commonwealth, and all of the devastation that followed. The reason why it was called Kerem, either because it was literally vineyards where they met, but Rashi's pshat and the more conventional pshat is that they arranged the hall where the sages would gather to be like a vineyard with many rows. And the closer you were to the front of the room, the higher in authority and priority. And so the front row were all of the very, very famous great rabbis. So they were all gathering for a session. They didn't all live in Yavne, but they would have a congressional, or they would have special sessions where they would gather and deal with the current events and the burning issues and halachic queries. So who was there? All the big names: Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yossi, who he quoted, Rabbi Shimon. And Nishala She'ela Zu B'fneim, among all the other topics that they were discussing, they asked the following: Makeh Zu Mipnei Ma Mascheles B'bnei Me'ayim V'Gomeres B'Peh. Why is Askara such a malady that it begins in the intestines, it begins deep in the GI tract, but ultimately culminates with malady, illness in the mouth? Nana Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Eloi. So Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Eloi, who was Rosh HaMedaber B'chol Makom, always the first to weigh in on a matter in Kerem b'Yavna, he said as follows: Afal pi shekloyos yoyatzois. Even though in the decision-making process, a human being has a vast internal process, starting with kloyos yoyatzois. They listen to their conscience, literally their kidneys give advice. The leiv mavin, and the heart adds a sense of clarity and understanding. Bilashon mechatech, and the tongue has a role in expressing that which you were thinking about and saying. Peh goimer, ultimately the word leaves one's mouth and the process concludes with your mouth. So again, you want to say something, somebody got you upset and you really want to lash out and you're not sure if you should or shouldn't, or you have a juicy piece of slander you want to share. And so you have an inner process. Should I say it? Well, I really shouldn't. And then your heart says that would be wrong or whatever. But ultimately you decide to say it. Well, the final end result is when one lets those words leave their mouth. And so I believe what we're saying here is that askara, this malady, travels upwards, so to speak. Again, not because the kidneys are literally part of the GI tract, but symbolically the illness travels upwards from inside, representative of the way the process unfolds within one's self. Rashi, Rosh HaMedabrim, why is Rabbi Yehuda the first guy to talk? And again, we're quoting here a Mishnah or a Braita. Rabbi Yehuda had a decree from the Roman. I don't know who led Rome then. Was it emperor? What do we call the leader of Rome at this time? I don't know, whatever it was.
Either emperor or Caesar, I guess. Yeah,
So
Caesar
whatever. This is after the fall of the temple. We're talking around 100, 120. Anyways, I don't know.
It's like Paro. It's the name of the leader.
All right, I don't know. Whatever it is, the king. Rashi says the king. Obviously, they didn't refer to him as king, but the ruler of Rome commanded that he be the one to always speak up first. Let's just see Rashi Pegoimer. Halashon hara, bad speech. Vuba al kach. Eventually, it comes through the mouth. Lefichach mascha b'me'ayim. I'm sorry, askara comes as a result of this. Lefichach mascha b'me'ayim. It starts in the innards. Misayim b'peh. Shalev mevin l'saper lashon hara. Ubayda hadvarim elibai. Ultimately, they spew forth from the heart through the mouth. Pegoimer hakol yotzim hagarin. Everything is executed and happens with the lips. There are many famous Jewish anecdotes in the Talmud and the Medrash that talk about the power of the tongue and the ability of one's mouth to create great harm, but also great blessing. And so this is another segment of the Talmud that reminds us that ultimately the lips, the mouth, gets a lot of the credit and a lot of the blame, because a lot of trouble. We think words are just words, but we're being taught here that words are quite profound, powerful, and strongly impactful to the recipients or the beneficiary or the victim of one's speech. So that's what Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Eloi said. Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Eloi says it travels the path of the internal process that leads to Lashon Hara. Then Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Elazar says, dvarim tameim, because a person consumes with their mouth impure stuff. The Gemara says, dvarim tameim sal kadaitach. Do you really suppose that we're talking about eating unkosher? And Rashi explains, do we find that there is a punishment of death for one who eats not kosher? Lashon hara, we do find that a person could lose their life. But for eating not kosher, there are consequences. But Rashi explains that the Gemara says, hey, I've never heard that a person could, God forbid, die from not eating kosher. So the Gemara says, rather, we're talking about a person that eats food that didn't first see its gifts gifted to our dear Levium. And so we see here that Rabbi Elazar talks about Askara, this illness, being a result also of not giving the tithe to the Levites. So I think what we see from here is that Rabbi Elazar believes it could be triggered by multiple misdeeds, if you will. Then Rabbi Shimon V'Amar, Rabbi Shimon answers, Ba'avoin B'Tol Torah, the reason why a person has this malady could be for failure to study Torah, and therefore it's with the mouth. Rashi, the Anash Nami Misa. So again, the subject again it continues to be quite jarring. The idea, of course, being that there are great blessings and protections provided by certain Jewish values and practices, and God forbid, consequences that could result, God forbid, for not having those protections.
I think Ascara it was called the kiss of death,
Is it?
and we call it today the croup.
Really interesting. You see, it pays to have medical professionals and physicians
think,
and pharmacists. The kiss of death. Doesn't sound like something you want to try at home.
No,
So you're saying the word askara could be associated with that. The Talmud is now going to have a very interesting line of questioning. Just giving you a heads up. Rabbi Shimon says that the disease could come for failure to study Torah. The Gemara wants to disprove it by saying, Noshim yoichichu. Let's prove that it can't be connected to bittul Torah, failure to study Torah, because women also catch it. And although women are allowed to study Torah, they don't have the same mandatory obligation to study Torah because of the time, a mitzvah that has time constraints. And so, although women are allowed to study Torah and have schar for studying, but because they're not obligated, they shouldn't be punished if they should fail to study Torah. So, what could be wrong? I'm just going to read the lines. Take it as you wish. Although they're allowed to study, they're not obligated, but they could find themselves deterring others from studying Torah. That would be an indication, and God forbid, a punishment could be for causing others not to study. What about Gentiles who do not have an obligation to study Torah, and yet they also catch askara, so it can't be a result of bittul Torah, failure to study Torah? And the Gemara answers, well, maybe they distracted an Israelite who is obligated from studying. What about children? They should not be punished. The Gemara says, well, maybe they deter Torah study in their home. Again, I'm not sure exactly what to do with this Talmud. I'm just reading it to you. What about kids that are studying Torah? They certainly don't deserve askara. Rashi. They don't waste Torah. They don't waste time. They don't deter others from studying. And yet they also have, God forbid, this illness. And now we're going to see a powerful, somber, sad, but powerful teaching, which might provide comfort, but also a lot of pain to some of the horrors that exist on this planet. Hasam Kedrabi Gorim. So you're talking about perfect children who study Torah. They've done nothing wrong. They can't possibly warrant such a punishment. Why would they die? Now, some questions are better left unanswered because we know that we don't know everything, but the Talmud is going to give some kind of perspective here. When they have truly righteous people in a generation and the generation commits sins, tzadikim nisvasim al hador. Well, then the punishment of the generation would be that the righteous are seized, taken away from that generation. Ein tzadikim b'dor, at a time where there are no righteous people. Tinoikos shel beis rabba nitvasos al hador. It could be that children are seized, children lose their life in that generation. And so what the Gemara is saying is, why do you see little children that are ill and suffering? They didn't do anything wrong. And the Gemara answers, you're right. They didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes they're not being punished for themselves, but this is a punishment or symptom of toxicity in that generation. Again, I don't know what to do with this Gemara. I'm just putting it before you. So again, on the one hand, maybe it's comforting. We know that children are innocent and of course, they're not being punished for their own sin. But there are sometimes somehow part of a bigger picture. Again, I'm not sure what to do with it, so we'll just let it stand as is. Well, I will add one comment though. Recently, we lost many great Torah leaders and scholars and people who truly can be defined as Einei Ha'eda, the eyes of the generation, the moral compass and clarity of our people. And we ask questions, again, not that we have answers, but why do these people take in? Why do they die? How could we lose on one day 3 great Torah scholars and people whose lives were entirely devoted to Torah study. And so I don't have an answer for you, and I'm not telling you this Gemara is an answer, but I will tell you that there are those who will quote this Gemara and say, well, maybe they're being taken maybe because there are shortcomings that we need to fix and deal with communally and as a society. Again, you're not going to hear me saying that, but I'm just telling you that there are those that would quote this Gemara. Then what happens is, so what are we doing wrong? And we have to have a World War III so we can all fight out what we're doing wrong, which is why it's not always healthy to even go down that road. But this is the Gemara, and this is what it is sharing. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak bar Zeiri, v'amri lo Rabbi Shimon ben Nezira Mikra. What's the meaning of this verse? Im lo teidi loch hayafa benashim tzilach beikvei hatzayin. Aminon gidiyim hamimushchanim ala royim shmamina af alashon hara ka'anami kamar shmamina. All right, let me read this in the English. The teaching says like this. There's a verse that says in Shir Hashirim, if you know not, you fairest among women, go your way forth by the footsteps of the flock. Again, a poetic description, a loving dialogue between two lovers. But of course, as we know, Shir Hashirim is not just a dialogue between two lovers, but it has deep, powerful spiritual messages. And so the way we read this, the Talmud reads it is as follows. If you can't find the fairest among women, if you can't find any decent human beings, people are not in a good state, the lambs could be taken as collateral. The word ha-mimushchanim, which we translate literally as the footsteps, sounds very similar to the Hebrew word mashkon, collateral. And so we're saying that, and many times young children are described as lambs. So we're saying is, God forbid, young children could be taken for the sins of the generation. So again, this is a very jarring, painful, difficult to eat segment in the Talmud, no question. Ironically, it's all being brought just to make one point, which is that this askar, this kiss of death, is not exclusively associated to Lashon Hara, but it could be associated with other issues as well. Again, I read in the Hebrew, but conclude from it that when Rabbi Lazar says Lashon Hara, he meant Nami Lashon Hara. Nami Kamar. He meant there's multiple possible causes for this kiss of death, for this askar. Okay, and it is at this point that we are in a moment going to see a very, very famous tale of the Talmud. But I do want to open up the floor. Again, I'm not going to have much wisdom or insight to add to what we've read, but if there's anyone that has any comments, I do want to welcome them now. No pressure, but if anyone has any comments, let's.
I guess it's something we'll never understand.
Yeah.
I mean, somebody does something bad, and 3 generations later, somebody suffers for it.
That's not what we're saying. We're not talking about it. We're talking about it in the same time. Again, it doesn't make it much better, but we're saying that in the same generation, the same moment, that sin, instead of the sinners being punished somehow, it could end up that some others, the great tzaddikim, or young innocent children could be the symptom or the victim, if you will, of that evilness. That's what we're saying.
I seem to have read.
It doesn't provide much comfort, but that's what the Gemara is saying.
Yeah, I think there was another part of the Gemara that states that it could happen to someone generations later.
You're quoting actually from the Ten Commandments that talks about how that the evil of a parent could be visited upon a child or a grandchild. That's not what we're saying here.
Okay.
And it says Hashem's goodness, Hashem's retribution could extend a few generations, but his goodness extends 1,000 generations. So But that's not this Talmud, certainly not. And the Talmud, in analysis of that verse, says, when children and grandchildren continue in an evil way, so then they could be punished, or they could be visited with punishment for their parents. But if they're doing right, they won't be punished. That is actually a good point for you to bring up, because it actually flies in the face of this Talmud. Again, I told you I'm not going to have any good answers, but I do. Yes, you're actually bringing up something that's fair, and it's a good question. So we didn't mention it here. Yes, Doctor.
Weren't many of these issues focused on after the Shoah, after the Holocaust, in terms of different Rabbanim giving interpretations of why 6 million and why
Yes.
Rav Shach and other people.
Yes, there was a very, very public and strong,
Yeah.
vigorous debate between Rav Shach and Lubavitcher Rebbe and others
Right.
about if it's correct to try to bring or portray a reason for the Holocaust. It was the Rebbe's view that as much as the Torah does talk occasionally about punishment or retribution, there is no possible calculation that would justify the magnitude of the loss, and there's no way to claim that we could make sense of it. The Rebbe said this is one of those things that you have to understand, that sometimes things happen that are beyond the capacity of mankind to understand, and that's a healthier, more rational way to take it than to try to start saying that all these communities of innocent people and men, women, and children deserved it because X, Y, and Z. Just to add, it was more than that, because the same person that made the comment that they knew the reason for the Holocaust said that the world deserves such punishment again because there's still these kind of sins. And that's really, I think, what really set the Rebbe and made the Rebbe very, very indignant on behalf. He said that Hashem doesn't need a lawyer, and Jews, we don't speak poorly about the Jewish people, and we don't wish or even suggest hardship should befall the Jewish people as a result of any kind of punishment. The Rebbe was very, very emphatic, very, very emphatic about that. So anyways, and that of course influences my view on the matter as well. And I'm proud of the moral clarity, in my opinion, of the Rebbe's viewpoint. And again, it wasn't the Rebbe. It wasn't about the Rebbe trying to give a pass. That was not the Rebbe's point. The Rebbe's point is that Hashem doesn't need a lawyer, and Hashem doesn't need us trying to make calculations and defending it. And it's not only insensitive, but the Rebbe said it's quite simply wrong to make such assertions. But indeed, that is part of the debate or the conversation that certain people had after the Holocaust. And you know what? Actually, so we'll leave it at that. Any other comments, please, or questions or thoughts? Professor, please.
By no means I would like to diminish the horror, cruelty, and enigma of the Holocaust. But what we shouldn't forget, staying in awe in front of the Holocaust, is that it's not a unique phenomenon. That what the Cossacks, Khmelnytsky did in the Ukraine was actually no different from the Holocaust. One can find some, minor differences in attitude, in justification or whatever, but it was the disaster that almost wiped out the whole generation. And what happened during the Crusades in Germany also was a disaster of terrible dimensions. From this point of view, when we stay in awe without an explanation, this segment of the Gemara actually, I think, encourages people who look for a cause and effect connection. That is, it says, you do bad, you get this. And this is a kind of thinking that probably encourages people to immediately find an explanation for those disasters. On the other hand, what strikes me here is that there is no discussion of why this doesn't happen. That is, in addition to those stories where something bad happens, we know that there are so many people who use lashon hara and do all kinds of other unseemly things, and they are not punished. And if we count how many people are punished and how many people do get away with that, we probably find that more people get away from that. That also requires an explanation. And on the other hand, the fact that we deal with that, it probably somehow mitigates the lack of understanding of the Holocaust, because many people who did those horrible things in this generation and in the Ukraine and in Germany, they got away with what they did, at least from the physical point of view. We don't know what happened with from moral point of view, but physically they weren't punished. And
Thank you,
this is-
Professor. Very, very, very interesting. Sorry, and thought-provoking thoughts. I appreciate that. And just to add, there's a saying that the Gemara is Divrei Torah aniyot b'makom echad v'ashirot b'makom acher. The Torah on occasion is poor, or doesn't provide the full, provides one angle of a subject, and can't provide the totality of a subject in one place. And so what you're saying is correct, that elsewhere the Talmud also discusses that many times. Actually, we discussed it recently, that sometimes an evil person could have a good life here, and a good and up there it deducts from any potential mitigation of their punishment. And conversely, good people can suffer on this earth, and that would allow them to optimize and maximize the bliss and the reward in the next world. And so the Talmud adds, I think, over here the possibility of literal punishment, or the possibility of literal reward, but I don't think it's necessarily making the statement that it's absolutely going to happen. I think it's more that when certain illnesses happen to a certain individual, they should contemplate if maybe it's a result of their own misdeeds. Then the Talmud expands the conversation and says, hey, but sometimes people are punished that never did anything to warrant it. And so the Gemara says, well, on occasion there could be a symptom, the disease. It's like when it depends how if you look at a body as a holistic, so a person could have an illness in one part of the body, but the symptom manifests, or the pain, it manifests in another part of the body, assuming you accept this kind of idea. And so I think what the Talmud is saying is, on occasion, the sin could be happening here, and the symptom could be the passing of a tzaddik or the passing of a child. I don't think we're making an absolute statement, or that it always will happen, or can happen, or should happen. And again, that doesn't negate in the least what you were saying. I'm just wanted to just expand upon the other factors to consider as to why these do it. What maybe it doesn't happen, or it does happen, but it's certainly a thought-provoking and big heavy topic. It doesn't even belong as item 227 on the doctor's list. This really is like item 1 on the next list of like mega heavy, topics. That,
Well, Rabbi, we could add to that list, just piggyback on Professor Victor's comment, that there have been major episodes of genocide over many millennia of and perhaps they continue today, as we know in other parts of the world, and good things happen to bad people is nothing new, and I don't think there's much of an answer for it. But to add to the list, we could perhaps have a discussion if people do not believe in Olam Haba, if they do not believe that there's any life after physical death, is there any reason really to follow a life of doing good deeds, whether you call them mitzvot or whatever you want to call them? So that's just for the next book, but that's a pretty heavy
very interesting
discussion.
Very, very interesting. Well, I want to thank all those that have shared. I don't know if we're going to have an opportunity actually now to get into this next very famous segment. I just want to give you the spoiler alert. I hope, again, I know everyone has different schedules. I hope you can all join us on Sunday, because I'd love to hear your thoughts on the next one. But the famous story of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his 13-year sabbatical, or leave of absence, where he's on the run from the Romans who seek to kill him. That whole story, what triggered that event? His experience in the cave, and the relative instability and inability to accept human beings as human beings upon emerging from the cave, and how he eventually came to appreciate his fellow human beings. That whole process, that story, is going to be the next segment of the Talmud. I just want to show you the opening, just so you see the connection. The Gemara asks, why was Rabbi Yehuda referred to as the head speaker, the first speaker, always. Today, we wouldn't call someone, Rabbi X, the guy who always speaks first. We probably have a more concise way of, but it seems like he literally, that was his title, Rabbi Yehuda. Rosh HaMedaber B'chol Makom, Rabbi Yehuda, the guy who always speaks first. And so the story goes that there was once a small rabbinic conference between Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And the rest, I hope you'll join us on Sunday to discuss. And the truth is, these Gemaras, on one hand, are impossible to fully recap, but on the other hand, they're easier than ever because there's so many details that we just stick to the general theme. Today's Talmud continued along the lines of the last 2 or 3 days, talking about the potential correlation of certain punishments or misfortunes and how they are associated to certain bad practices. The initial conversation of the Talmud is about nivel peh, crass vulgarity, and how there could be punishments and it could undo goodness that a person is destined to. Sometimes speaking crassly or with vulgarity doesn't necessarily mean saying things that are not true, but certain things are understood and known by all, but don't need to be fully spelled out unless they do need to be spelled out. And then we spoke about how a person that prepares themselves for sins, well, then they could have STDs. If a person engages in unsanctioned intimate acts, they could pick up with multiple partners, they could pick up an STD. That's what the Talmud says. So in case you needed a reference in the Talmud about that, you could bookmark this Talmud here. The Talmud then talks about different kinds of hidrokan, different kinds of this stomach malady. Sometimes it could be triggered by sin, sometimes by hunger, and sometimes by witchcraft. We then went through a series of rabbis who had this illness, starting with Shmuel HaKatan, who was able to leverage his illness and say, Hashem, if you don't heal me, people will think I've sinned, and he's healed. Abaye had it, but it's because he would deprive himself of the pleasure of this world. Rava had it, and we said it was because the students would not let him get to the restroom on time, and that would cause GI problems. And we said that there are different, we went to another text, different sins, different symptoms, and we talked about asker, which our dear Kohen Gadol and in-house pharmacist tells us was referred to in those days as the kiss of death. The Talmud describes how it was an illness that traveled from lower in the GI system up to the mouth. And the question is, what is it connected to? It could have been connected to Lashon Hara. It might have also been connected to other things. You brought an interesting story about the rabbis who were discussing Askara and why it travels as it does. One said it travels because it travels along the path relative to the path of a person who decides to speak Lashon Hara. Others, and that was where we were introduced to the title, Yehuda, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Eloi, Rosh HaMedaber B'chol Makom, Yehuda, son of Eli, the first guy to always talk. We then had another explanation because of eating food that didn't have the gifts to the Levi, and we also said it's possibly connected to Bittul Torah. We asked a bunch of questions. How could people who are not obligated to study Torah get asker if that's the case? And the Talmud kept on answering, well, maybe it's because they deter and prevent others that are obligated to study Torah. We then were introduced to the very sobering and painful teaching that the Talmud gives, that sometimes righteous people could die prematurely, not because of their own sin, but as a kind of symptom or punishment to the generation. And even more horrifying, even more painful, occasionally young, good, innocent children could also be a punishment to the generation, although they are entirely innocent. And of course, that brought up some very, very heavy, important, and familiar questions that we discussed. And I want to thank everyone for sharing. And then we introduced what's, God willing, going to be Sunday's discussion, which is the story of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and how he turned into be the great guy he was, and the great pains and troubles that he had to go through until that point. And for that, I hope you'll join us tomorrow. Just first of all, when we're going to end this, I hope you'll rejoin Shalom Bar Chomish today to study today's Chomish. I also would like to close as we open. Today is a day full of beautiful dedications. And so today's learning honors our dear Dr. Pasternak for his birthday. And we again, collectively, wish you a year of mazel and bracha and health and happiness. And we hope you'll have many more good years together with us, inspiring us on the Gemara chat. So Dr. Pasternak, our Levi, happy birthday. Today we also dedicate for the 50th yahrzeit of our Reb Noach, whose grandfather's yahrzeit is today, 50th yahrzeit. We're within the week of the yahrzeit of Eliyahu Tzvi, Rabbi Yochanan HaLevi Zal, our dear doctor, the other Dr. Levi's father's yahrzeit, and the month has been dedicated for Chayalea Bas Binyamin. And finally, in prayers and wishes for good circumstances, health, and happiness for all of Klal Yisrael and the entire world. I want to wish everyone a wonderful Shabbos, a good Chodesh. We should find the joy within, and we should have many reasons to be full of joy on this month of Adar. We'll ask Hashem to give us many reasons and excuses to be joyous and maybe a little relief from all of the insanity and the craziness. Closing comments?
Quick public service announcement, please, for the Lamer community. I came on late because yesterday Hotwire rewired our apartment. They're doing it for each of the units. And just make sure before they leave that all of your devices are working and that you know what to do if they are not working. That's what I couldn't get on for 15 minutes, computers and stuff.
Thank you, Walt. I hope ultimately it all works out. We were actually wondering if we were abandoned by our Lamerian Levium.
Yeah.
And Kohen. Actually, that's interesting. We were wondering in the beginning, it was Noach and Mark and myself, and we're like, where are all the Levis and the Kohanim? But now we realize that it seems like Lamer has something special to do with the Kohen and Levi population.
Hasn't touched us yet.
Now it all makes sense. Thank you all. Have a wonderful day. Good Shabbos.
Let's go.
Good Shabbos.
Shabbos.
Yeah.